Welcome back to History Snapshots, and by this point you guys should be familiar with Italy's invasion of Ethiopia, Germany's violation of the Munich Pact by invading Czechoslovakia and Poland. Also, you guys should know that Hitler and the Nazis absolutely annihilated the French, occupying Paris by 1941. And finally, you should know that Hitler broke his promise to Stalin when he chose to invade the Soviet Union in 1941. So, keeping all that in mind, it is time to start looking at how the United States responded to all this aggression going on in Europe. So that is going to be the subject of the video, how the United States responded to the aggression in Europe. So, by the end of this video, make sure you can answer the question, what was America's initial response to the aggression in Europe? So get ready to take some notes, answer that question, and learn some more history. Believe it or not, the United States, despite being one of the world's strongest powers, wanted to remain out of World War II. The United States was committed to staying out of World War II because, as you know, after World War I, the country returned to a policy of isolationism, or a policy of remaining apart from the affairs or interests of other countries. So, with this policy of isolationism in mind, the United States thought it was best to remain separated from the fighting that was taking place in Europe. To ensure America's neutrality, Congress passed the Neutrality Acts of 1935. The Neutrality Act of 1935 was designed to keep the U.S. out of the war. It prevented FDR from selling arms, making loans, or giving any other kind of assistance to any nation involved in war. So, with the Neutrality Act of 1935, America made a point to remain separated from any wars that were going on because, again, it was best for the United States to remain isolated. Another piece of legislation that shows America's commitment to remaining isolated from the rest of the world is FDR's Good Neighbor policy. FDR implemented the Good Neighbor policy because he, wanted America to be a better neighbor. Under the Good Neighbor policy, America decided to withdraw all of its troops from Latin America. So once again, the Good Neighbor policy shows how the United States was taking steps towards isolationism by the 1930s. Okay, so here's where things can get a little tricky, so make sure you're paying close attention. Now, the first part of this video has made it really clear that at the start of the war, FDR and the United States really wanted to remain isolated from the fighting that was taking place in Europe. In fact, FDR won an unprecedented third term on the slogan, quote, "Your boys are not going to be sent into any foreign wars," end quote. Now, at the same time, FDR really hated Hitler and the idea of a dictatorship ruling Europe. So that being said, FDR took several steps to get the United States involved in World War II without being overly committed to the fighting. So let's take a look at some of those steps right now. The first step Roosevelt took to helping the Allies was his cash and carry policy. Now, the cash and carry policy was very important because it allowed the United States to sell arms to Britain without violating the Neutrality Acts of 1935. Because what Roosevelt did to implement the cash and carry policy was he made a compromise with Congress. He said to Congress, look, we should be able to sell arms to Britain as long as they pay for those arms in cash and they carry those weapons over on their own ships. So this way here, the United States could help their British allies without having to risk getting their own ships shot down by carrying the weapons overseas to the British. So Roosevelt's second step was the implementation of the Lend-Lease Act of 1940. By 1940, it was very clear that the British were running out of money, and they could no longer afford the United States cash and carry policy. But Roosevelt was determined to help the British defeat the Nazis, so he persuaded Congress to pass the Lend-Lease Act of 1940. And the Lend-Lease Act allowed the United States to lend or lease supplies to the Allies fighting the Nazis, as well as carry those supplies on United States ships. So this is very different from the cash and carry policy because remember, under the cash and carry policy, Britain had to pay cash and carry those weapons on their own ships. But now, by 1940, under the Lend-Lease Act, the United States started sending their own ships filled with weapons over to the British. In fact, the American convoys that traveled across the Atlantic were known as the Arsenals of Democracy. Roosevelt's third step was his plan to build up the military. So by 1940, Roosevelt implemented the first peacetime draft in the United States history. Even though the United States was not fighting the war at this point, Roosevelt thought it was necessary to have a draft and make the United States get ready for war. Also, in 1941, Roosevelt and Winston Churchill implemented the Atlantic Charter. And the Atlantic Charter was a document that outlined the goals for the United States and Britain after the war. And one of these goals included an international peace organization, kind of like the League of Nations, but this one Roosevelt and Churchill hoped would actually work and keep the peace. There you have it. That concludes the second episode of History Snapshots. But before you X out of this video, make sure you, number 1, understand all highlighted terms. Number 2, answer all the questions below, especially that essential question from the beginning of the video. And number 3, write down something that confuses you so you can bring it up in class tomorrow. Thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoyed.